The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty training ground of Fort Liberty as Private Maya Chen struggled under the weight of a massive supply crate that seemed designed to break her spirit rather than build her strength. At 23, she stood just 5 feet 4 inches with shoulder-length light brown hair pulled back in a regulation bun that was already coming loose from the morning's brutal physical training. Her bright blue eyes, which had once sparkled with the confidence of someone who'd never faced real adversity, now carried the exhausted determination of a soldier who'd been pushed to her absolute limits every single day for the past 6 months. Her athletic but feminine build, earned through years of tennis and swimming at private schools, seemed almost fragile compared to the imposing figures of the drill sergeants who'd made her life a living hell since the day she'd stepped off the bus at basic training. But what nobody at Fort Liberty knew, what she'd hidden behind carefully crafted lies and forged documents, was that Private Maya Chen was actually Maya Thompson, the only daughter of 4-star General Robert Thompson, one of the most powerful and respected commanders in the entire United States Army. And today, that secret was about to explode in ways that would change everything. But before we dive into this incredible story that'll leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about military family dynamics, make sure you're subscribed to Those Who Left a Trace for more shocking military revelations that will blow your mind. Hit that notification bell, because what happens when this general discovers his daughter has been hiding in plain sight will absolutely stun you. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez circled Maya like a predator stalking wounded prey, his imposing 6 feet 2 inches frame casting a shadow over her struggling form as she attempted to carry supply crates that outweighed her by 30 pounds. At 35, Rodriguez had built his reputation on breaking recruits who thought they were tougher than they actually were, and Private Chen had become his favorite target from the moment she'd shown up looking like she belonged in a college sorority rather than an army training facility. His weathered face, marked by 2 tours in Afghanistan and a permanent scowl that suggested he'd never met a recruit he couldn't crush, bore down on Maya with undisguised contempt. "Chen, you worthless piece of garbage," Rodriguez barked, his voice carrying across the training yard and drawing snickers from the other recruits who were grateful not to be in Maya's position. "My grandmother could carry more weight than you, and she's been dead for 10 years. Maybe you should have stayed home and played dress-up instead of wasting the Army's time and money trying to turn you into something resembling a soldier." Maya gritted her teeth and adjusted her grip on the supply crate, her muscles screaming in protest as she forced herself to keep moving despite the exhaustion that threatened to drop her where she stood. The other recruits in her unit watched with a mixture of sympathy and relief, knowing that as long as Rodriguez was focused on Chen, they were safe from his particular brand of psychological warfare. But what they didn't know, what Maya had worked so hard to hide, was that this wasn't her first experience with military discipline and expectations. Growing up as General Thompson's daughter had meant a childhood filled with military protocol, physical fitness standards, and expectations that would have crushed most children before they reached their teens. While other kids were playing video games and watching cartoons, Maya had been learning hand-to-hand combat from her father's security detail, studying military history and strategy, and maintaining the kind of physical fitness that most adults could never achieve. But she'd also learned something else that had brought her to this dusty training ground in North Carolina. That being the general's daughter meant never knowing if people respected her for who she was or feared her because of who her father was. "Chen, did you hear me talking to you?" Rodriguez's voice cut through her memories like a knife. "Or are you too busy daydreaming about whatever fantasy land you came from to pay attention to your superior officer?" "No, sir," Maya replied with a crisp professionalism that had been drilled into her since childhood. "Just focusing on completing the task, Sergeant." Rodriguez stepped closer, his breath hot against her face as he invaded her personal space with the kind of intimidation tactic that had broken stronger recruits than Maya appeared to be. "You know what I think, Chen? I think you're here because Mommy and Daddy wanted to teach their precious little princess a lesson about the real world. I think you've never worked a day in your life, never faced real adversity, and never had to earn anything through actual effort and sacrifice. If only you knew," Maya thought to herself as she continued struggling with the supply crate. "If only you knew that I've been training for this since I was 8 years old, that I've spent summers at military academies that would make this place look like summer camp, and that the man whose expectations I've been trying to live up to my entire life could end your career with a single phone call. But Maya said nothing, just as she'd said nothing for the past 6 months while Rodriguez and the other drill sergeants had made her the unit's primary target for humiliation and punishment. She'd enlisted under her mother's maiden name, Chen, and had carefully constructed a background that showed her as the daughter of middle-class immigrants who'd worked multiple jobs to put her through college. The forged documents had cost her a small fortune and several months of preparation, but they'd held up under scrutiny from military background investigators who had no reason to suspect that a general's daughter would voluntarily subject herself to the hell of enlisted basic training. "Chen, you're holding up the entire unit," Sergeant Williams called out from across the training yard. At 28, Williams was younger than Rodriguez, but no less brutal in his treatment of recruits who failed to meet his impossibly high standards. "Maybe if you spent less time in the beauty salon and more time in the gym, you could actually contribute something useful to this platoon." Maya's jaw clenched at the casual sexism that had become a daily part of her existence at Fort Liberty. She'd grown up around military men who treated her with respect because they knew exactly who her father was and what he was capable of doing to their careers if they stepped out of line. This casual dismissal of her abilities based solely on her gender and appearance was something new and infuriating, but it was also exactly why she'd chosen to enlist as a private, rather than accepting the officer commission that her father's influence could have easily secured. What would you do in Maya's situation? Comment below if you think these drill sergeants are about to learn the hardest lesson of their military careers, because what happens next will completely change the power dynamic at Fort Liberty. The morning's torture session finally ended after 3 grueling hours that left Maya's uniform soaked with sweat and her muscles trembling with exhaustion. As the platoon filed into the mess hall for lunch, she found herself isolated at a table in the corner. The other recruits avoiding her not out of malice, but out of fear that associating with Rodriguez's favorite target would make them targets as well. It was a survival instinct that Maya understood even as it left her eating alone day after day, maintaining the carefully constructed persona of the struggling recruit who didn't quite belong in the Army's ranks. Private Jackson, a 19-year-old from rural Georgia, who'd enlisted straight out of high school, had occasionally shown Maya small kindnesses when the drill sergeants weren't watching. He slid into the seat across from her with the nervous energy of someone who knew he was taking a risk by associating with the unit's designated outcast. "Chen, you okay?" he asked quietly, glancing around to make sure Rodriguez was within earshot. "You look like you were about to collapse out there during supplies training." Maya managed a weak smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm fine, Jackson. Just need to build up my strength, I guess. Not everyone's cut out for this from day one." Jackson studied her with the kind of insight that sometimes surprised her coming from someone so young. "You know, there's something different about you, Chen. Can't quite put my finger on it, but you handle Rodriguez's bullshit differently than most recruits. Like you've dealt with authority figures before. You know what I mean?" Maya's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her expression neutral. Just trying to follow orders and not make waves, same as everyone else. "Maybe," Jackson said, but his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Just seems like sometimes you catch yourself before you say something. Like you know more than you're letting on." Before Maya could respond, the mess hall fell silent as Sergeant Rodriguez entered with his usual entourage of drill instructors. His eyes immediately found Maya's table, and she could see the wheels turning in his head as he decided how to make her afternoon even more miserable than her morning had been. "Chen," Rodriguez's voice boomed across the mess hall, causing every conversation to stop as recruits turned to watch the latest episode in his ongoing campaign to break the small woman who seemed to absorb punishment without ever fighting back. "Since you had so much trouble with basic supply duties this morning, I think you need some extra practice. Report to the supply depot after chow. You'll be doing inventory until 2200 hours. Maya nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement that somehow managed to convey both compliance and dignity. "Yes, Sergeant." "And Chen," Rodriguez added with a cruel smile that made several recruits shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Since you seem to enjoy Jackson's company so much, he can join you. Maybe he can teach you how to actually do your job without embarrassing the entire United States Army." Jackson's face fell as he realized his moment of kindness had earned him a 12-hour work detail, but he nodded without complaint. Maya felt a stab of guilt at getting him punished for her sake, but she also knew that any attempt to defend him would only make things worse for both of them. That afternoon, as Maya and Jackson worked in the sweltering heat of the supply depot, organizing and counting thousands of items ranging from uniforms to ammunition, she found herself wrestling with the constant temptation to reveal who she really was. One phone call to her father would end Rodriguez's career and transform her from the unit's punching bag into someone whose every word carried the weight of four-star authority. But it would also invalidate everything she was trying to prove to herself about who she was beyond her father's influence and reputation. "Chen, can I ask you something?" Jackson said as they worked their way through a particularly tedious section of winter gear inventory. "Why do you really enlist? And don't give me that line about serving your country that you told the recruiters. There's something else going on here." Maya paused in her counting, a heavy winter coat hanging from her hands as she considered how much truth she could safely reveal. "I wanted to prove something to myself, I guess, that I could make it on my own merit without any help or special treatment." "Make it on your own?" Jackson raised an eyebrow. "Chen, you talk like someone who's used to having help available. Most of us enlisted because it was our best option, not because we were trying to prove some philosophical point about independence." Maya realized she'd said too much, revealed a perspective that didn't match her carefully constructed background as the daughter of working-class immigrants. "I just meant that I wanted to earn my place here, not have anyone think I got special treatment because of my background or connections." Jackson was quiet for a moment, processing her words with a kind of careful thought that suggested he was putting together pieces of a puzzle he didn't fully understand. "You know, Chen, sometimes you sound like someone who's had military training before. The way you stand, the way you respond to orders, even the way you organize supplies when you think nobody's watching. It's not natural for a civilian." Maya's blood ran cold as she realized that despite all her efforts to appear like a struggling recruit, her lifetime of military training was showing through in ways she hadn't anticipated. "I just watch how other people do things and try to copy what works." "Maybe," Jackson said again, but his tone carried the same skepticism she'd heard earlier. "Or maybe there's more to Maya Chen than meets the eye." Before Maya could respond, the supply depot door burst open with enough force to rattle the metal shelving units that lined the walls. Sergeant Rodriguez stood in the doorway with an expression that suggested he'd been looking forward to this moment all day. "Chen, Jackson, front and center," he barked. "I hope you two lovebirds have been working instead of chatting, because I got some special guests who want to see how our supply management is coming along." Maya's stomach dropped as she saw who was standing behind Rodriguez in the doorway. Colonel Martinez, the base commander, was flanked by two officers she didn't recognize and a man in civilian clothes whose bearing and confidence screamed federal authority. But it was a fourth figure that made her blood freeze in her veins. A tall man in dress uniform whose 4 stars glinted in the fluorescent lighting of the supply depot. General Robert Thompson, her father, stood less than 20 feet away from her with an expression that suggested he was conducting a routine inspection of base facilities. His steel gray hair was perfectly styled, his uniform pressed to absolute perfection, and his weathered face bore the kind of commanding presence that made junior officers straighten their spines and check their appearance instinctively. At 52, he represented everything Maya had been trying to escape. The weight of expectations, the burden of living up to a legendary reputation, and the constant question of whether people respected her for who she was or feared her because of who he was. What Maya didn't know, couldn't have known, was that General Thompson's inspection of Fort Liberty wasn't routine at all. He'd been investigating reports of systemic problems in the training program, including allegations of abuse, harassment, and discriminatory treatment that could undermine the Army's recruitment and retention efforts. His daughter's presence at the base was a coincidence that was about to become the most significant moment in both of their military careers. Get ready, because what happens when this general comes face to face with his daughter will leave you absolutely speechless. Smash that like button if you're ready to see some serious military justice served. Colonel Martinez, unaware of the family drama about to unfold in his supply depot, stepped forward with the kind of nervous energy that came from hosting a surprise inspection by one of the Army's most powerful generals. "General Thompson, these are 2 of our recent graduates from basic training. Private Chen and Private Jackson have been assigned to supply management duties as part of their ongoing training program. General Thompson's eyes swept over the two recruits with the kind of professional assessment that had made him legendary for identifying talent and potential in soldiers at every level of command. When his gaze landed on Maya, she saw a flicker of something that might have been recognition, but his expression remained perfectly neutral as he evaluated what appeared to be just another young recruit trying to find her place in the Army hierarchy. "Private Chen," the general said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made colonels nervous and sergeants break into cold sweats. "How long have you been at Fort Liberty?" Maya snapped to attention with the kind of precision that drew surprised looks from Rodriguez and Martinez. 6 months, sir," she replied with crisp professionalism that seemed to come naturally despite her exhausted appearance. "And how would you evaluate your training experience so far?" The question hung in the air like a live grenade with the pin pulled. Maya could feel Rodriguez's eyes boring into her, warning her without words that her answer could have serious consequences for her remaining time at Fort Liberty. She could also sense her father's penetrating gaze, though she couldn't tell if he'd recognize her or was simply conducting a routine evaluation of training conditions. "The training has been challenging but fair, sir," Maya replied carefully. "The drill sergeants maintain high standards that push us to exceed what we thought were our limits." General Thompson nodded slowly, but something in his expression suggested he was hearing more than just her words. "Sergeant Rodriguez, is it?" he said, turning to the drill instructor who'd been tormenting Maya for months. "How would you evaluate Private Chen's performance and adaptation to military life?" Rodriguez straightened to attention, clearly feeling the weight of speaking to a 4-star general about one of his recruits. "Sir, Private Chen has struggled with some aspects of the physical training requirements. She's shown improvement over the past 6 months, but she still requires additional supervision and motivation to meet Army standards." "Additional supervision," the general repeated, his tone carefully neutral. "Can you be more specific about what that entails?" Maya held her breath as Rodriguez considered his response, knowing that her father was famous for his ability to read between the lines and identify problems that other commanders missed. The next few minutes would determine whether months of careful deception would be exposed in the most dramatic way possible. "Well, sir," Rodriguez began, his confidence growing as he warmed to his favorite subject, "Private Chen came to us without the kind of physical preparation we expect from serious recruits. She's required additional PT sessions, extra duty assignments, and closer supervision to ensure she meets the standard we maintain for all soldiers in this unit." "I see," General Thompson said, his expression remaining unreadable. "And Private Jackson, how would you describe the training environment here at Fort Liberty?" Jackson glanced nervously between Maya and Rodriguez before answering. "It's demanding, sir, but that's what we expected. The drill sergeants push us hard, but they're preparing us for real military service." General Thompson walked slowly around the supply depot, examining the organization and efficiency of the inventory system with the kind of attention to detail that had made him legendary for operational excellence. Maya watched him move with a familiar confidence she'd grown up observing, and she could see him processing information and forming conclusions with the speed that had made him one of the Army's most effective strategic planners. "Sergeant Rodriguez," the general said finally, "I'd like to observe some of your training methods firsthand. Can you demonstrate how you would typically conduct additional physical training for a recruit who's struggling to meet standards?" Rodriguez's eyes lit up an opportunity to showcase his methods to a 4-star general. "Absolutely, sir. Chun, front and center. Let's show the general how we work on building strength and endurance." Maya stepped forward with growing dread, realizing that Rodriguez was about to humiliate her in front of her father while having no idea who he was actually targeting. The irony was almost overwhelming. The man who'd spent months trying to break her spirit was about to demonstrate his methods to the one person in the Army who could end his career with a single word. "Chen, give me 50 push-ups, perfect form," Rodriguez commanded. "And while you're doing them, explain to General Thompson why you think you deserve to wear the uniform of the United States Army despite your obvious physical limitations." Maya dropped to the push-up position and began the exercise with a kind of perfect form that drew surprised looks from everyone watching. Her military training from childhood had given her a level of fitness that she'd been carefully hiding for months, but the stress of the situation was making it harder to maintain her facade of weakness. "Sir," Maya said between push-ups, her voice steady despite the physical exertion, "I believe every soldier has the potential to contribute to the mission, regardless of their starting point. The Army taught me that determination and character matter more than initial physical capabilities." General Thompson watched her perform the push-ups with growing attention, his experienced eye noting the perfect form, controlled breathing, and obvious physical capability that contradicted Rodriguez's assessment of her as a struggling recruit. Something about her movements, her voice, and her bearing was triggering recognition that went beyond her professional evaluation. "That's interesting, Private Chen," the general said quietly. "Where did you learn that particular philosophy about determination and character?" Maya hesitated for just a fraction of a second, a pause so brief that only someone who knew her extremely well would have noticed it. "From my family, sir, they taught me that success comes from refusing to quit, no matter how difficult the circumstances become." "Your family," the general repeated, his tone carrying new intensity. "And what did your family teach you about military service and duty?" The questions were becoming more personal and more dangerous with each exchange. Maya could feel Rodriguez watching her with growing suspicion, wondering why a four-star general was taking such detailed interest in a recruit he dismissed as a failure. She could also sense her father's growing recognition, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place in ways that would soon make her secret impossible to maintain. "They taught me that service to country is the highest calling," Maya replied, completing her 50th push-up and returning to attention. "And that wearing the uniform is a privilege that must be earned through dedication and sacrifice." General Thompson stared at her for a long moment, his expression cycling through surprise, recognition, and something that might have been pride mixed with concern. The silence in the supply depot stretched until it became uncomfortable for everyone present. "Sergeant Rodriguez," the general said finally, his voice carrying a new edge that made the drill instructor straighten nervously. "I'm curious about your assessment of Private Chen's capabilities. You mentioned that she struggles with physical standards, but what I just observed suggests otherwise." Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably, realizing that his harsh evaluation was being challenged by someone whose opinion could affect his entire career. "Sir, Private Chen has shown some improvement over recent weeks, but her initial performance was well below what we expect from incoming recruits." "I see," the general said, his tone suggesting he was seeing far more than Rodriguez intended to reveal. "And how exactly do you motivate recruits who are struggling to meet your standards?" The question was a loaded one, and everyone in the room could sense it. Rodriguez found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to defend his training methods to a general who was clearly developing concerns about what he was witnessing. "We use progressive physical training, additional duty assignments, and intensive supervision to build character and resilience, sir," Rodriguez replied carefully. "The methods may seem harsh to outside observers, but they're designed to prepare soldiers for the realities of combat deployment." "Progressive physical training," the general repeated, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made experienced officers nervous. "Can you elaborate on what that entails for Private Chen specifically?" Maya watched the exchange with growing anxiety, realizing that her father was conducting an investigation disguised as a routine conversation. She could see him building a case against Rodriguez's methods, while simultaneously piecing together the truth about her identity and presence at Fort Liberty. "Well, sir," Rodriguez continued, oblivious to the danger he was walking into, "Private Chen has required additional PT sessions, extended duty hours, and closer supervision because of her initial deficiencies. We focus on building her strength and endurance through intensive training that pushes her beyond her comfort zone." "Additional PT sessions," the general said, making mental notes that Maya recognized from years of watching him prepare for important meetings. "How many additional hours per week would you estimate Private Chen has been required to complete?" Rodriguez began to realize that his answers were being recorded and evaluated in ways that might not be favorable to his training methods. I don't keep exact records of additional training time, sir. We focus on results rather than paperwork." "Of course," the general said with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Results are indeed important. Private Chen, how many hours per week would you estimate you've been required to complete beyond the standard training schedule? Maya found herself in an impossible position. Telling the truth about Rodriguez's excessive punishment would expose the abuse she'd been enduring, but lying to her father would compromise the investigation he was clearly conducting. She chose a middle path that revealed enough truth to be useful, without making her appear to be complaining about treatment that other recruits were probably enduring as well. Approximately 15 to 20 additional hours per week, sir, Maya replied with military precision, including extended PT, supply duties, and facility maintenance. The number drew sharp looks from Colonel Martinez and the other officers present. 20 additional hours per week represented nearly a 50% increase over standard training requirements, suggesting either severe deficiencies in recruit or potentially abusive training practices. 15 to 20 hours, General Thompson repeated, his voice carrying a note of disapproval that made Rodriguez's face pale visibly. And this additional training has been consistent throughout Private Chen's 6 months at Fort Liberty? Maya nodded once, a gesture that seemed to confirm suspicions that had been building in her father's mind throughout the conversation. Yes, sir. Though Sergeant Rodriguez has explained that the additional training is necessary to bring my performance up to Army standards. General Thompson turned to Rodriguez with an expression that had made generals nervous and ended the careers of officers who'd failed to meet his standards for ethical leadership. Sergeant Rodriguez, in my experience, recruits who require that level of additional training typically either wash out a program within the first month or demonstrate dramatic improvement that eliminates the need for continued intensive supervision. Can you explain why Private Chen falls into neither of those categories? The question was a trap, and Rodriguez was beginning to realize it. Either Chen was unfit for military service and should have been discharged months ago, or she was being subjected to excessive punishment that served no legitimate training purpose. There was no good answer that would justify the situation he'd created. Sir, Private Chen has shown gradual improvement, and we believe that continued intensive training will eventually bring her performance to acceptable levels, Rodriguez replied, his confidence clearly shaken. Gradual improvement over 6 months, the general said, his tone making it clear that he found this explanation inadequate. Private Chen, do you feel that your performance has improved significantly since beginning your training here? Maya realized that her next answer would either expose Rodriguez's methods as abusive or validate his assessment of her as a failing recruit. She chose honesty, knowing that her father would be able to read between the lines even if Rodriguez couldn't. Sir, I believe I've learned a great deal about military standards and procedures during my time here. Whether that constitutes the kind of improvement Sergeant Rodriguez is looking for will be better assessed by my instructors than by myself. It was a diplomatic answer that revealed everything without directly accusing anyone of misconduct. General Thompson nodded slowly, his expression suggesting that he'd heard exactly what he needed to hear, confirm his growing suspicions about the training environment at Fort Liberty. Wait, before you go, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your city or country in the comments. We want to see how far this incredible story has traveled. And hey, if this confrontation is getting intense, hit that like button because you haven't seen anything yet. The tension in the supply depot had reached a breaking point that everyone could feel, but no one fully understood. General Thompson continued his seemingly routine evaluation, while actually conducting a detailed investigation into training practices that were becoming more questionable with each answer. Rodriguez, meanwhile, was slowly realizing that his methods were being scrutinized by someone with the authority to end his military career. Colonel Martinez, the general said, turning to the base commander who'd been watching the exchange with growing unease, I'd like to review the training records for Private Chen and several other recruits in this unit. I'm particularly interested in documentation of additional training requirements and the criteria used to determine when such measures are necessary. Martinez nodded quickly, understanding that a request from a 4-star general was actually an order that would require immediate compliance. Of course, sir. I'll have those records prepared for your review within the hour. Excellent, General Thompson replied, then turned back to Maya with an expression that seemed to carry layers of meaning she couldn't fully interpret. Private Chen, I'm curious about your background prior to enlisting. What motivated you to choose military service? Maya felt her heart racing as her father's questions became more personal and more dangerous to her carefully maintained cover identity. She could see him studying her face with a kind of intense attention that had always made it impossible for her to hide anything from him during her childhood. "I wanted to serve my country and prove that I could succeed in a challenging environment, sir," Maya replied with a kind of standard answer that recruiting officers heard thousands of times each year. "Prove that you could succeed," the general repeated thoughtfully. "That's an interesting way to phrase it. Prove to whom exactly?" The question cut to the heart of everything Maya had been struggling with for the past 6 months. She'd enlisted to prove to herself that she could succeed without her father's influence, but standing in front of him now, she realized that her motivations were more complex than she'd admitted even to herself. "To myself, sir," Maya said quietly. "I wanted to know that I could earn my place through my own efforts rather than through any advantages I might have had in civilian life." General Thompson studied her with the kind of penetrating gaze that had made him legendary for identifying potential in young officers. Something about her answer, combined with her appearance and bearing, was clearly triggering recognition that went beyond her professional interest. "Private Chen," he said slowly, his voice carrying a new quality that made everyone in the room pay closer attention. "Have we met before? There's something familiar about you that I can't quite place." Maya felt the blood drain from her face as her father moved closer to recognizing her despite the months of carefully maintained deception. She could see Rodriguez watching the exchange with confusion, wondering why a 4-star general was taking such personal interest in a recruit he'd written off as a failure. "No, sir," Maya replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I don't believe we've had any previous contact." But even as she said the words, Maya could see her father's expression changing as pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. The voice that had been nagging at his memory, the familiar bearing and confident responses to military questioning, and most importantly, the blue eyes that looked exactly like his own daughters were combining to create a recognition that would soon be impossible to deny. "Private Chen," General Thompson said, his voice carrying a new intensity that made Colonel Martinez step forward with concern. "What is your mother's maiden name?" The question hit Maya like a physical blow. Her father knew exactly what her mother's maiden name was, since that was a name she'd used to enlist under false pretenses. Any answer she gave would either expose her deception or force her to lie directly to his face about something he already knew. "Chen, sir," Maya replied, knowing that the truth was now inevitable. "My mother's maiden name is Chen." General Thompson stared at her for a long moment that stretched into eternity, his expression cycling through recognition, shock, concern, and something that might have been paternal pride mixed with serious concern about what he was discovering. "Maya," he said quietly, using her first name for the first time since entering the supply depot. "What the hell are you doing here?" The use of her first name sent shockwaves through everyone present. Rodriguez's face went white as he realized that the recruit he'd been tormenting for months was somehow personally connected to a 4-star general. Colonel Martinez stepped forward with obvious alarm, understanding that a major situation was developing under his command. Jackson's eyes widened as he began to understand why Maya had always seemed different from the other recruits. "Sir, I can explain," Maya began, but her father cut her off with a gesture that carried decades of command authority. "Sergeant Rodriguez," General Thompson said, his voice carrying the kind of cold authority that made experienced officers fear for their careers, "I want you to step outside and wait for further instructions. Colonel Martinez, please accompany him and ensure that this conversation remains private until I determine how to proceed." Rodriguez and Martinez exchanged glances of pure panic, understanding that they were being dismissed from a conversation that would likely determine their professional futures. They filed out of supply depot with the kind of nervous energy that came from knowing their careers were hanging in the balance. Jackson started to follow them, but General Thompson held up a hand to stop him. "Private Jackson, you can stay. I have a feeling your perspective on recent events might be valuable." Once the door closed behind departing officers, General Thompson turned back to Maya with an expression that combined paternal concern with professional disappointment in ways that made her feel like a child again despite her military training and adult responsibilities. "Maya Elizabeth Thompson," he said, using her full name with the kind of authority that had always made her straighten her spine and prepare for serious consequences. What the hell did you think you were accomplishing by enlisting under false pretenses and subjecting yourself to 6 months of what appears to be systematic harassment? Maya stood at attention, falling back on military protocol to help her navigate the most difficult conversation of her life. Sir, I wanted to prove that I could succeed in the military based on my own merit rather than through any influence or advantages that might come from my family connections. Your own merit, General Thompson repeated, his voice carrying a note of incredulity. And you thought the best way to test that was to lie about your identity, forge enlistment documents, and allow yourself to be abused by drill instructors who clearly have no idea how to properly evaluate and develop military talent? The words stung because they contained enough truth to be painful. Maya had indeed subjected herself to abuse that went far beyond normal military training, and she'd done it while maintaining a deception that could have serious legal consequences for everyone involved. I wanted to experience what real soldiers go through without anyone treating me differently because of who you are, Maya said, her voice carrying the frustration and determination that had driven her to make this decision 6 months earlier. What real soldiers go through, her father repeated, his anger building as he began to understand the full scope of what had been happening to his daughter under his nose. Maya, what you've been experiencing is not what real soldiers go through. What you've been experiencing is abuse disguised as training, and it's exactly the kind of systematic problem I came here to investigate and eliminate. Jackson, who'd been standing silently during this exchange, suddenly spoke up with a kind of insight that had made Maya respect him despite their brief acquaintance. Sir, if I may, Maya never complained about the treatment she was receiving, and she never asked for special consideration. But she also never seemed like someone who was actually struggling the way Sergeant Rodriguez claimed. She always seemed like she was holding back, like she knew more than she was showing. General Thompson turned to Jackson with newfound interest. Can you elaborate on that observation, Private? Well, sir, Jackson continued, gaining confidence as he realized the perspective was being taken seriously. Maya always responded to orders like someone who'd had military training before. Her bearing, her physical capabilities when she thought nobody was watching, even the way she organized supplies and equipment. It was like watching someone pretend to be less competent than they actually were. Maya felt her heart sink as Jackson's observations confirmed what her father was probably already suspecting, that her deception had been far from perfect and that observant people had noticed inconsistencies in her performance throughout her time at Fort Liberty. Maya, General Thompson said, his voice carrying the kind of paternal concern that had always been more effective at getting through to her than any amount of military authority. How long did you think you could maintain this deception? And what exactly did you think would happen when the truth eventually came out? Maya met her father's gaze directly for the first time since he'd entered the supply depot, seeing in his eyes the same combination of love and exasperation that had defined their relationship throughout her childhood and adolescence. I thought I could complete my training and prove myself before anyone discovered who I really was, Maya admitted. I wanted to know that any success I achieved was based on my own capabilities rather than on fear of what you might do to people who treated me badly. Fear of what I might do, General Thompson said, his voice carrying a new note of understanding as he began to grasp the complexity of his daughter's motivations. Maya, do you really think so little of your own abilities that you believe people only treat you with respect because they're afraid of me? The question cut to the heart of everything Maya had been struggling with since childhood. Growing up as a daughter of an increasingly powerful and influential general had meant never knowing whether people's positive responses to her were genuine or motivated by their desire to stay on her father's good side. I don't know, Maya said honestly. I've never had the chance to find out. Everyone I've ever met in military circles has known exactly who you are and what you're capable of doing to their careers. I wanted to experience at least once what it was like to be evaluated purely on my own merit. General Thompson was quiet for a long moment, processing his daughter's words and the implications of what she'd been trying to accomplish through her elaborate deception. When he spoke again, his voice carried a mixture of pride and concern that made Maya understand how much this discovery was affecting him. Maya, what you've accomplished here is remarkable in ways you probably don't fully understand, he said slowly. You survived 6 months of what appears to be systematic abuse while maintaining your cover identity and performing well enough to avoid being discharged despite deliberate attempts to break your spirit. You've demonstrated exactly the kind of resilience and character that the Army needs in its leaders, regardless of your family connections. Maya felt tears threatening to spill from her eyes as she heard something in her father's voice that she'd been hoping to hear her entire life. Recognition of her own capabilities independent of his influence and reputation. But she also knew that the revelation of her true identity would have consequences that extended far beyond their personal relationship. "Sir," Maya said, falling back on military formality to help her navigate the emotional complexity of the situation, "what happens now?" "To me, to Sergeant Rodriguez, to the investigation you were conducting." General Thompson looked at his daughter with the kind of complex expression that combined paternal love with professional responsibility in ways that made clear how difficult this situation was for him to handle. "What happens now is that we deal with the consequences of your deception, while also addressing the systematic problems that made your experience here so unnecessarily brutal." Jackson, who'd been listening to this exchange with growing amazement, suddenly spoke up with a question that had obviously been bothering him. "Sir, if Maya is your daughter, does that mean she's been lying to all of us for 6 months? About her background, her family, everything?" General Thompson turned to Jackson with an expression that suggested he appreciated the young soldier's directness. "Private Jackson, my daughter made some poor choices about how to conduct her evaluation of military training, but her motivations were honorable. She wanted to experience military service without the influence of family connections, which is something I can understand even if I can't approve of her methods. So she really is qualified to be here," Jackson said, more as a statement than a question. "All those times Rodriguez said she was weak or unprepared, he was wrong." "Maya has been receiving military training since she was 8 years old," General Thompson replied, his voice carrying a note of pride that made Maya's chest tighten with emotion. "Physical fitness, tactical thinking, leadership principles, military history, and protocol. She's probably better prepared for military service than 90% of the recruits who come through this facility." Jackson turned to Maya with an expression that combined amazement with something that might have been respect. "So when you were struggling with those supply crates this morning, you were pretending?" Maya nodded, feeling the relief of finally being able to drop at least part of the act she'd been maintaining for months. "I was trying to appear consistent with Rodriguez's assessment of my capabilities. If I performed at my actual level, it would have raised questions about why I was receiving so much additional training and punishment. Which means," General Thompson said, his voice carrying a note of cold anger that made Maya understand how furious he was becoming as he grasped the full scope of what had been happening to her, "that Sergeant Rodriguez has been systematically abusing my daughter for 6 months while believing she was a weak recruit who deserved punishment for failing to meet basic standards." The implications of that statement hung in the air like a thundercloud ready to unleash lightning on everyone involved. Maya could see her father's mind working through professional and legal ramifications of Rodriguez's treatment of her, and she could tell that the sergeant's career was about to come to a very abrupt end. "Dad," Maya said, using a familiar term for first time since his arrival, "please don't destroy Rodriguez's career because of what he did to me. He didn't know who I was, and he was treating me the same way he probably treats other recruits he perceives as weak." "Maya," General Thompson replied, his voice carrying the kind of parental authority that had always made her listen carefully to his words. "That's exactly the problem. Rodriguez has been systematically abusing recruits who he perceives as weak, using methods that have no legitimate training purpose and that violate every principle of effective military leadership. The fact that you were his target doesn't make his methods wrong. It just makes them personal for me." Jackson nodded in agreement with the general's assessment. "Sir, if I may, Maya wasn't the only one Rodriguez treated badly. He just seemed to focus on her more than most. But there were other recruits who got similar treatment before they either washed out or got transferred to different units." General Thompson's expression darkened as he realized that his daughter's experience was part of a larger pattern of abuse that had been affecting multiple recruits under Rodriguez's supervision. "Private Jackson, I'm going to need you to provide a detailed statement about what you observed during your training here, and I'll need the names of other recruits who may have been subjected to similar treatment." "Yes, sir," Jackson replied without hesitation. There are probably a dozen recruits who could tell you stories about Rodriguez's methods that would make what Maya went through seem mild by comparison. Maya felt a stab of guilt as she realized that her ability to endure Rodriguez's abuse had come from training and resources that other recruits didn't possess. While she'd been treating the harassment as a test of her character, other soldiers had been genuinely suffering under methods that served no legitimate training purpose. "Sir," Maya said, addressing her father with the kind of serious tone that had always gotten his attention during important family discussions, "if you're going to investigate Rodriguez's methods, I want to testify about what I experienced. Not as your daughter, but as a witness to systematic abuse that needs to be stopped." General Thompson looked at Maya with an expression that combined pride in her moral courage with concern about the consequences of her involvement in what would inevitably become a major investigation into training practices at Fort Liberty. "Maya, your testimony would be valuable, but your presence here under false pretenses complicates everything about this investigation. The defense attorneys will argue that your deception invalidates anything you might say about Rodriguez's methods." "Maybe," Maya replied, her voice carrying the kind of determination that her father recognized from years of watching her tackle difficult challenges. "But Jackson and the other recruits can provide corroborating testimony, and your investigation was already underway before you discovered who I was. Rodriguez's methods are wrong regardless of who his victims are." Jackson stepped forward with the kind of courage that had made Maya respect him despite their brief acquaintance. "Sir, if it helps, I can testify that Maya never received any special treatment from Rodriguez. If anything, he seemed to single her out for worse treatment than most recruits received. Whatever abuse happened here, it wasn't because anyone knew who she really was." General Thompson nodded slowly, understanding that Jackson's testimony would be crucial to establishing that Maya had been treated as just another recruit rather than receiving either positive or negative special treatment based on her family connections. "All right," he said finally, his voice carrying the kind of command authority that had made him legendary for handling complex and sensitive military situations. "Here's what's going to happen. Maya, you'll be transferred immediately to a different unit where your identity will remain classified while this investigation proceeds. Jackson, you'll provide a detailed statement to military investigators about everything you've observed during your training here. And Sergeant Rodriguez is going to have a very serious conversation with military law enforcement about his training methods and their compliance with Army regulations." Maya felt a mixture of relief and disappointment as she realized that her 6-month experiment in anonymous military service was coming to an end. She'd proven to herself that she could survive military training without her father's protection, but she'd also learned that some battles were too important to fight alone. "Sir," Maya said, standing at attention as she prepared to accept whatever consequences would follow from the revelation of her identity, "I know that my deception was wrong and that it created problems for everyone involved. I'm prepared to accept whatever disciplinary action is appropriate for falsifying enlistment documents and serving under false pretenses." General Thompson looked at his daughter with an expression that suggested he was still processing all the implications of what she'd done and what it revealed about both her character and his own parenting. "Maya, what you did was indeed wrong from a legal and procedural standpoint. But what you endured over the past 6 months has also demonstrated exactly the kind of character and resilience that the Army needs in its leaders. We'll figure out how to address the legal issues, but I want you to understand that I'm proud of what you've accomplished here, even if I can't approve of how you went about accomplishing it." The sound of voices and footsteps outside the supply depot interrupted their conversation, signaling the return of Colonel Martinez and probably several other officers who'd been waiting for instructions on how to handle the situation that was developing under their command. "Maya," General Thompson said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of paternal love that had always been the foundation of their relationship despite the complexities introduced by his military career. "We're going to have a lot more to talk about once this immediate crisis is resolved. But I want you to know that what you've proven to yourself over these 6 months is something I've always known, that you have the strength and character to succeed in anything you choose to pursue, with or without my help." Maya felt tears threatening to spill from her eyes as she heard the words she'd been hoping to hear from her father since childhood, recognition that her capabilities were her own rather than reflections of his influence and reputation. Before she could respond, the door to the supply depot opened to admit Colonel Martinez, followed by Sergeant Rodriguez and several other officers whose expressions suggested they understood that a major situation was developing on their base. Rodriguez looked pale and nervous, clearly understanding that his conversation with a four-star general about his training methods had not gone well. "Gentlemen," General Thompson said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone in the room straighten instinctively, "we need to discuss some serious concerns that have come to light regarding training practices at this facility. Colonel Martinez, I'll need to speak with you privately about the scope and timeline for a formal investigation into allegations of abuse and harassment in your training programs." Rodriguez stepped forward with the kind of desperate courage that came from knowing his career was probably over regardless of what he said. "Sir, if this is about my training methods with Private Chen, I was simply maintaining the standards that have been established for this unit. Everything I did was within the guidelines for handling recruits who struggled to meet basic requirements." General Thompson turned to Rodriguez with an expression that combined professional disappointment with personal anger in ways that made clear exactly how serious the sergeant's situation had become. "Sergeant Rodriguez, what you did to Private Chen over the past 6 months was not training. It was systematic abuse designed to break her spirit rather than develop her capabilities. The fact that she survived your methods and maintained her performance standards despite your harassment is a testament to her character, not an endorsement of your training philosophy." "Sir, I don't understand," Rodriguez replied, his confusion genuine as he struggled to comprehend how his treatment of what he believed was a failing recruit had become a career-ending confrontation with a four-star general. "Private Chen has consistently struggled with physical requirements and needed additional supervision to meet basic standards." "Sergeant Rodriguez," General Thompson said, his voice carrying the kind of cold authority that had ended the careers of officers who'd failed to meet his standards for ethical leadership, "Private Chen is my daughter, and she has been conducting an unofficial evaluation of training practices at this facility while serving under an assumed identity. What you perceived as weakness was actually someone with extensive military training deliberately limiting her performance to maintain her cover." The words hit Rodriguez like a physical blow that left him staggering both literally and figuratively. His face went through a series of expressions ranging from shock to horror, to the kind of sick realization that comes with understanding that your career has just ended in the most catastrophic way possible. "Your daughter," Rodriguez whispered, the implications of what he'd been doing for 6 months crashing down on him with enough force to make his legs weak. "Sir, I had no idea. If you had known, you would have treated her differently," General Thompson finished for him. "Which is exactly why she chose to serve under false pretenses. And it's exactly the problem we need to address here. The fact that you would modify your training methods based on a recruit's family connections rather than their individual needs and capabilities demonstrates fundamental failures in your understanding of military leadership and development." Colonel Martinez stepped forward with obvious concern about the situation developing under his command. "General Thompson, sir, I need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with here. How long has your daughter been serving at this facility, and what are the implications for our training programs?" "Colonel, my daughter's been here for 6 months, during which time she's been subjected to what appears to be systematic harassment and abuse disguised as additional training," General Thompson replied. "Her experience, combined with similar reports from other recruits, suggests that we have serious problems with training philosophy and implementation that need immediate attention." Jackson, who'd been listening to this exchange with growing amazement, suddenly spoke up with information that made the situation even more serious. "Sir, if I may, there are other recruits who've been treated even worse than Maya was. Some of them washed out of the program, and others got transferred to different units. But they all went through similar treatment from Sergeant Rodriguez and some of the other drill instructors." General Thompson turned to Jackson with the kind of intense attention that suggested this information was crucial to his understanding of the situation. "Private Jackson, I'm going to need you to provide detailed information about these other cases, including names, dates, and specific examples of inappropriate treatment." "Yes, sir," Jackson replied without hesitation. "I can provide names and contact information for at least 8 other recruits who went through similar experiences before either leaving the program or getting reassigned." The scope of the problem was becoming clear to everyone in the room. What had started as a routine inspection had revealed systematic issues with training practices that affected multiple recruits and represented serious failures in leadership and oversight at Fort Liberty. Rodriguez, meanwhile, had gone completely pale as he began to understand that his treatment of General Thompson's daughter was only the beginning of his problems. The revelation that other recruits had similar experiences suggested a pattern of behavior that would be impossible to defend or explain away as necessary training methods. "Sergeant Rodriguez," General Thompson said, his voice carrying the kind of finality that suggested major decisions were being made. "You are hereby relieved of all training duties pending a full investigation into your methods and their compliance with Army regulations regarding the treatment of personnel under your supervision. You will report to the base legal office within 1 hour to begin providing statements about your training philosophy and specific practices." Rodriguez nodded numbly, understanding that his military career was effectively over regardless of what any investigation might conclude. The fact that he'd unknowingly abused a 4-star general's daughter for 6 months would ensure that his case received the kind of attention that would end with courts-martial and criminal charges. Maya watched Rodriguez's downfall with mixed emotions. Part of her felt satisfied that justice was finally being served for months of unnecessary abuse, but she also felt guilt about the role her deception had played in what was happening to him. "Dad," she said, using the familiar term that made everyone in the room understand the personal nature of what had transpired, "I don't want Rodriguez's punishment to be about what he did to me specifically. I want it to be about the pattern of abuse that affected other recruits who didn't have my advantages or resources." General Thompson looked at his daughter with an expression that combined pride in her moral character with continued concern about the complexities of the situation she created. "Maya, Rodriguez's punishment will be based on his systematic violations of military law and regulations regarding the treatment of personnel under his command. The fact that you were one of his victims doesn't change the fundamental wrongness of his methods." Colonel Martinez, meanwhile, was beginning to understand that the problems at his facility were far more serious than he'd realized, and that his own career might be in jeopardy depending on how much responsibility he bore for allowing abusive training practices to continue under his command. "General Thompson," Martinez said, his voice tight with professional concern, "I need to understand what steps we should take immediately to address these problems and prevent further incidents while the investigation proceeds." "Colonel, we're going to implement immediate changes to training supervision and oversight," General Thompson replied. "All drill instructors will receive additional training on appropriate methods for handling recruits who struggle with different aspects of military life. And we're going to establish new reporting mechanisms for recruits who believe they're being subjected to abusive treatment." The changes General Thompson outlined would transform not just Fort Liberty, but potentially training facilities throughout the Army. Maya's 6-month deception had exposed systematic problems that required comprehensive solutions, and her father's investigation would lead to reforms that would protect future recruits from the kind of abuse she'd endured. As the immediate crisis began to be resolved and the various officers started making plans for investigations, transfers, and policy changes, Maya found herself reflecting on what she'd accomplished during her time at Fort Liberty. She'd proven to herself that she could survive military training without her father's protection, but she'd also learned that some problems were too big and too important to handle alone. That was intense. But there's more where that came from. Click this video right now to see another military family secret that changes everything when the truth finally comes out.